Every fan of Roman history has certainly at least once, but very likely more than once, thought about how the world would look today if the Roman Empire had never fallen. Such a thought is of course utterly fascinating, because we probably can all agree that such a world would look vastly different from the one we are currently living in. But of course, there are many different ways in which the Roman Empire could have survived into our modern day and age. Of course, most who have thought about this alternate world probably have thought about how the Western Roman Empire could have been saved. And indeed, one of the main points of this channel here was to prove that the Western Roman Empire could have been saved many times. But due to a combination of really bad decisions by incapable emperors and the wrong decisions at the wrong time, it did fall. And we actually did talk in some detail about the world where the Roman Empire never fell. However, in this video here, we would like to think about the world where the Western Roman Empire did end, like in our timeline, but the Eastern Roman Empire survived into our modern times. So let us think about how such a world would look in which the Eastern Roman Empire never fell. Now, possibly the biggest what-if moment of the Eastern Roman Empire happened already quite early after the line of Western Roman emperors had ended in 480 AD with the cowardly murder of Julius Nepos. We remember that with the ending of the Western Roman emperors, now Germanic kings ruled Italy as some sort of viceroys of the Eastern Roman Emperor at Constantinople. So on paper, Italy was still part of the one Roman Empire. Factually, however, these Germanic rulers grew more and more independent from the emperor at Constantinople. This culminated at some point in the Eastern Roman Empire starting to reconquer the, from their perspective, lost Western Roman provinces. The first to fall were the Vandals in 534. And then, in 536, the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian ordered his most able general Flavius Belisarius, who had also conquered the Vandal kingdom, to attack the Ostrogothic kingdom of Italy that had started to act all too independently. The war went initially very well and great victories were won. By 540, the war was factually over and the Eastern Roman Empire had almost managed to reconquer the whole of Italy, save for the areas north of the Po River. But then, something terrible happened in our timeline. The plague broke out in Egypt in 541 and swept across the entire Roman Empire, killing millions of Romans and killing many Roman soldiers. In fact, the size of the Roman army was cut in half after this event, dropping from about 300,000 to only 150,000. This is when things started turning massively south for the Eastern Romans. Even though Italy could still be conquered after a lengthy and devastating war, and even though the south of Spain could be reconquered as well, the problem was that just too many Romans had died and they were just spread out too thinly over the old reconquered Roman lands. But what if the plague of Justinian had never happened? Well, in such a timeline, we can imagine that the Ostrogoths would not have managed to have such a resurgence after 541 as happened in our timeline with their king Totila. And thus the war between the Romans and the Ostrogoths would have very likely been over much sooner. At some point, it is probable that the Romans would have conquered the rest of the Ostrogothic kingdom north of the Po River. Then later, with a lot more manpower at their disposal, Belisarius would have conquered the Visigothic kingdom. Maybe even the south of Gaul could have been reincorporated into the Roman Empire, and the city of Arelate might once again have been in Roman hands. This reborn Roman Empire would have stood much better chances to withstand the later trials, since with twice the army size and a non-weakened population, the resurgence of the Roman Empire might have been enduring. However, in order to endure, this resurgent Roman Empire would have needed to avoid the rise of Focas. What broke the neck of the Eastern Roman Empire in our timeline was the accession of Focas. Indeed, we could call the year 602 one of the worst years of the Roman Empire. If you are a fan of Roman history and you would want to buy an item for yourself or someone else as a present, then you might want to consider the SPQR Shop. They produce incredible replicas of Roman history with a very high attention to detail. All their items are carefully handcrafted, and I think it will be difficult to find that level of craftsmanship anywhere else. They handcraft Roman coin replicas, rings, pendants, attributes, and many other items of Roman history. If you want to support the channel, or if you want to buy a present for someone who likes Roman history, please go and check out their excellent site, link in the description. If you buy over this link, you will receive a 20% price reduction, which I personally find very generous. Thank you very much for your consideration, and back to the video. When Focas took over the purple and executed the Emperor Maurice, and then when the war against the Sasanians started as a direct consequence, the fate of both the Eastern Roman Empire and of the Sasanian Empire was sealed. Because this devastating war then allowed Islam to rise. And this is what destroyed the Sasanian Empire in our timeline and really weakened the Eastern Roman Empire. So in order for the reconquests of Justinian to be lasting, this war would have needed to be avoided at all costs. The Emperor Maurice in those days was a very good strategist. However, he had failed to foresee the mutiny of his army beyond the Danube River while they were campaigning against the Avars. Had he better understood the situation, the rise of Focas would have been averted and Maurice could have ruled for 10, maybe even 15 more years. This very likely would have prevented the devastating Sasanian War, and hence the rise of Islam would have been prevented. It would have remained an insignificant local Arabian religion. The Eastern Roman Empire would have consequently never have lost its eastern provinces, and the Persian Empire would have continued. The stalemate situation between those two empires would have continued for a few more centuries. It is hard to say what would have happened later, and it is quite possible that another devastating war would have happened sooner or later between those two mighty empires, with possibly one gaining the upper hand over the other. However, it is quite unlikely that one side would have completely obliterated the other side, and maybe this equilibrium state would have continued in some form for many more centuries. The Mongol invasions, though, would have affected the Sasanian Empire in this timeline far more than the Eastern Roman Empire, and it is quite possible that the Sasanians then might have ended. If the Eastern Roman Empire would have used that situation to their advantage, they would have never have to fear a strong Sasanian Empire ever again. The Franks, the British and Germany would have still formed in this timeline, because even with the full power of the Eastern Roman army, it would have been, in my opinion, quite unlikely that Justinian and Belisarius or any of their successors would have managed to completely conquer the northern Germanic kingdoms of the Franks, of the Anglo-Saxons and of the Alemanni. Therefore, even in this timeline, we would have seen the forming of European nation-states, even though in a different form than in our timeline. Italy, Spain, the Balkans and Africa would have remained firmly in the grasp of the Eastern Roman Empire. The rise of Russia would have happened as well in this timeline. However, the Renaissance as we know it would not have happened, since the Middle Ages as we know them would not have happened as well in this timeline, because the Mediterranean would have remained a Roman lake, and thus there would have been a very homogeneous culture and identity centered around the Mediterranean, very much the same as in antiquity. Many of the ancient sites would have continued to exist, and even the city of Rome would not have seen the devastations of a prolonged Gothic war as happened in our timeline. Thus, in this altered timeline, many more of the ancient monuments would have survived, restored in many cases, and preserved as ancient monuments and some sort of national treasures. Hence, the Middle Ages would have been more benign, more friendly in that timeline. Without the rise of the Italian city-states, of Florence, of Venice, there would not have been an Italian Renaissance as we know it from our timeline. Constantinople in this timeline would not have fallen in 1453, but it would have continued more splendorous than ever before. And so, there would have been no need for a Renaissance, because the old never really died in that timeline here, especially not in the East. But would the Age of Discovery have started as well in such an alternate reality? Indeed, the competition between the warring nation-states of Europe is what led to great innovations and inventions, and hence to the Age of Discoveries and then to the Industrial Revolution. A continued Eastern Roman Empire would not have been a very innovative state. But with an ever-present danger of a very large and powerful continued Roman Empire that still somehow maintained the possessions from Justinian reconquests, the smaller kingdoms of northwestern Europe would have maybe not have competed as much against each other. And thus maybe the Industrial Revolution would have happened later in this timeline. It is, however, also conceivable that this Roman Empire would have fractured at some point again into a western part and an eastern part. Religious schisms and the language barrier might have caused such a split. A fracturing into smaller parts is also possible though. In that scenario, these sub-empires that descended from Justinian's reconquered Roman Empire would have then competed much more against each other. And this balance of power would have also allowed the smaller kingdoms of Europe to persist and to innovate. This might then actually have led to the Age of Discovery, to the Age of Colonization, and then ultimately to the Industrial Revolution. Other points of divergence can of course be considered as well. For instance, Constans II might not have been murdered in his bath, and so he might have successfully reconquered the lost eastern provinces. Or we might also imagine a timeline in which the successors of Basil II would have been more competent and would not have disbanded a lot of the Eastern Roman army. With a strong continued military discipline, the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 might either not have happened, or it might have resulted in an Eastern Roman victory. An Eastern Roman Empire that would have remained strong in that timeline would have had huge consequences for world history. In fact, I find such a timeline possibly the most interesting one, because a point of divergence in the 11th century might have allowed Western Europe to compete and hence to sooner or later usher in the Age of Discovery and the Industrial Revolution. But it would also have allowed the Eastern Roman Empire to remain strong and retain the lands that Basil II and preceding emperors had conquered. This reduced Roman state, smaller than the one of Justinian, would have had, in my opinion, better chances of surviving as a unit because of it being smaller. So therefore the chances of fracturing would have been far lower. In that timeline, in my opinion, the sack of Constantinople of 1204 would not have happened as well, since the Eastern Roman Empire would have been far more powerful, having not lost the Battle of Manzikert and a lot of lands in Anatolia. Thus, the Western Europeans would never have even gotten the idea in the first place. Nobody would have wanted to mess with a strong Eastern Roman Empire. The Turks would never have conquered Anatolia, and even though maybe the Eastern Roman Empire would have possibly lost some territory sooner or later, it would have remained a strong state even until the Renaissance. Here we would have the Renaissance, yes, similar to our timeline, but with an intact and competitive Eastern Roman Empire. And this would have been very interesting, since they would also then have sailed around the world and probably established colonies, like Spain and Portugal in our timeline. Constantinople in that timeline would have been an utterly impressive city, queen of cities, never fallen and never conquered. Monuments more than 1,000 years old would have impressed visitors from all around the world. This Eastern Roman state might have survived even until modern times in some form or another. But with Constantinople never having fallen, it would still be a Greek-speaking city now, and many of the old monuments would have been carefully preserved. Since the Eastern Roman Empire would have had colonies around the world in that timeline, we might even have Greek-speaking countries in South America or in Africa in such a timeline. A truly fascinating thought. We can imagine many different divergence points and thus many different surviving forms of Eastern Roman empires. Of course, heavily depending on when the timeline diverged from ours and how it diverged. But one thing they do all have in common. They are all equally fascinating to us, and the mere thought of a surviving Eastern Roman Empire and an impressive Constantinople that never fell certainly evokes emotions in every fan of Roman history. If you like this video, please consider supporting this channel via Patreon or via YouTube membership, because it is your support which makes this channel possible. You would have my utmost gratitude. And of course, I want to thank everybody who supports Maiorianus. You people are absolutely wonderful and amazing. And if you want to learn more about how the world would look if the Western Roman Empire never fell, you can watch this video in the upper right corner. But if you want to learn more about the city of Constantinople itself, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago and bene valete.